Hello, good evening, and welcome to Business of Property. I'm your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. I begin by acknowledging our traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. At the Business of Property, we interview superstar guests in the property development space that share their expertise, their deals, their stories to help empower, build, and grow our community of impactful property developers. So, hello, Facebook Land, LinkedIn, YouTube, and anywhere else that you are joining us here today. Please drop me a hello in the comments below. And today we're going to be talking about, and this is very topical. Everyone has seen the ads. Lots of people, the buzzword NDIS, disability housing, and there's a bit of a mystique around it, really. Some people are very strong proponents of it, some are not. So we thought this is a great opportunity. A dear friend of mine, Richard Williams, who I've known for quite a few years now, and I've been watching his journey, and particularly in the most recent years, has been focusing on disability housing. And so I thought, Richard, it'd be great if you could share your journey with us, and share a bit more about why you've chosen to develop special disability housing, and the, I guess, sort of the journey of the ups and the downs. So without further ado, Richard, would you please join me on the Business of Property dance floor?
Thank you, Cheryl. It's great
Hello,
to be here.
hello. Great to have you here, Richard. It's I said we've known each other for quite a few years, and I know you've had, just like all of us have, it's been sort of a roller coaster of different types of projects and all of that, but you've really found your thing in what you're doing now. So tell us a little bit about how, I mean, high level, how you got into the property space, and more specifically how you got drawn towards the NDIS space.
Sure. Look, I guess I've always had an interest in property. My background is with Defence and the Air Force, and I moved around a bit with work, and worked with a few other guys that were doing some small developments and some projects, some duplexes. So I did a couple of joint ventures with some guys from work when none of us probably could have done a deal on our own. And I did one of those, a joint venture to start with. Look, and it didn't go very well at all, Cheryl. We all lost a bit of money in about 2008 in the global financial crisis. It was $15,000 or $20,000 loss by the time we sold the site with the approvals and had demolished the house. But there were some good lessons there, and I've taken those lessons with me to future projects. And I kept things a bit more simple. The next time I did a joint venture, but it was 50-50 with myself and some friends, and we built a duplex, and we kept one each. And as I've moved around with Defence over the years, I continued to do small developments and continued to do projects, and stayed sort of in that small development space. The value adds, buy a block of land, keep the house at the front, put a couple on the back, buy an old house, knock down the house, build a duplex. So I've stayed around that small development space, and the value add mostly where I could keep within the resi finance space. And more recently, I've got a few projects on the go now, and branching out, doing some buyer's agent work and project management for clients, and still staying in that small space, focusing around the Newcastle and Hunter area. So I've got a number of projects there. Some are dual occupancy, and the majority of them have a disability accommodation focus as well, because it's great to have some chunk deals and make some chunks of money along the way. But the real goal of property is having that income from property. And there's some good conversations, particularly with the recent election, around what's the longevity of NDIS. Is it here forever? What's the risk? And there's definitely policy risk around NDIS. My take on the the most recent election and the Labor government is, they're a stronger proponent for NDIS than Liberal were, and Liberal were definitely supporting it. So I don't see it going anywhere in the short to medium term. However, broadly speaking, I'm quite comfortable in the space because the properties I'm developing have got a broad appeal. Yes, they're suitable for people with disabilities, but they're in areas which are desirable to more than just people with disabilities. There's infrastructure nearby, shops, transport, close to sort of the urban centres. Additionally, sure, they might have large oversized bathrooms at the moment, but in the future we can, if we needed to, convert those into en-suites with 2 vanities, double shower heads, and we've got all of a sudden like a fantastic oversized ensuite for that couple that wants that bit extra space. Or we can take some of that space and we can put it into walk-in robe, or we've got that flexibility in the design. So I'm not particularly fussed about the long-term longevity of the NDIS. Don't get me wrong, I'm certainly enjoying the golden times whilst there's demand and strong demand for properties. I think it's a great opportunity at the moment, but longer term, I'm not fussed. Should the program disappear tomorrow, I think the properties that I've got and putting in my portfolio have a long-term value that's more than just NDIS. So I see that as one of the real strengths that you can incorporate into this space.
Fantastic. So, Richard, for those that are joining us and who sort of go, I don't know very much about NDIS or disability housing and all that. Is it the same? Are they different? Let's sort of peel it back and take it down to sort of the foundational level of what is NDIS and what does NDIS stand for? What's this program you're talking about? And I know you've got some slides as well, so I might get Jet, our tech support, to bring that up. So people who are visual learners, oh, there we go.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, I suppose, so just quickly, NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's a federally funded insurance scheme, and it's got lots of elements to it. So it's for people with disabilities to support them in multiple different ways. And specialist disability accommodation is one element of the NDIS. For example, there's funding for people to live in their own homes. There's funding for the in-home care of people, for the participants to get out and about in the community and participate in community activities and events, to get along to specialist appointments, and multiple things under that NDIS umbrella. Now, only a small percentage of those who are eligible for the NDIS actually have a requirement and a funding element in their NDIS package for specialist disability accommodation, or SDA as it's known. But having said that, there are other types of disability accommodation that aren't funded by the NDIS. However, any SDA must comply with the requirements of the NDIS, and there's a design standard which applies to the specialist disability accommodation. So it goes above and beyond the National Construction Code. It makes sure that there's sufficient circulation spaces within living areas, that it's easy to get in and out of doors, that doorways are a certain minimum width as the participants need. And there's actually multiple funding requirements or ways that people are assessed in their requirements for specialist disability accommodation. The highest level of requirement is actually high physical support. So that's for those that are the least mobile in our community. So generally speaking, they would have quite high physical needs, potentially be in an electric wheelchair, and you would also have hoists to assist getting the people in and out of their chairs, in and out of bed, possibly helping get them into the bathrooms. And they require quite a high level of physical assistance. So that's called high physical support. And one level down from that is fully accessible. So again, these people are have quite high mobility requirements, and they're in wheelchairs, but not necessarily needing the winches and hoists to get in and out of bed and perhaps to the bathrooms or toilets or showers. But they still require, wider hallways than a standard house would have, wider doorways, additional circulation spaces within the house. So that's fully accessible. The lowest level of requirements is called improved livability. And, that's for people that, for example, may have an acquired brain injury, like an autism spectrum type assessment that requires some special living requirements, perhaps blindness or some vision impairment. And that would be at the improved livability, perhaps reduced mobility. So they may be on a walking frame. Many of the people that are or do qualify for the improved livability funding levels do use a walking frame for assistance for mobility and getting around. And then there's another level of care as well called robust. And to generalise, that would be for those with some psychosocial issues, those that have difficulty perhaps regulating their emotions and are prone to outbursts. So those, when they're having
4
their
categories.
moments, yeah, for robust, that those outbursts may be directed at people or property or a combination of the two. And people in wheelchairs, for example, may also have some robust requirements. They may be prone to some issues regulating their emotions also. So essentially there's 4 levels of SDA, Cheryl. Whilst the highest level of funding is attached to the high physical support, that's also the area with the least actual level of demand. And those that are getting into the market at the moment are certainly aiming for those high physical support participants and aiming for those higher levels of return. So as more dwellings are completed, there's less people with those requirements needing accommodation. So what we'll find is that more and more people building accommodation and expecting people with the high physical support levels of funding will be not able to get people at that funding level, and they will potentially be able to get participants within the scheme, but on lower funding levels. So they may be expecting a higher level of return, and that may not eventuate for them in their particular circumstances, depending on the local area and what the needs are in that area at the time, and also the number of other properties available within that area.
And you raise a really important point there, because I we see a lot of this type of housing being developed, and the question is it a chicken, is it a chicken or egg type thing? Which should come before the other? So, if you look at it being 4 different categories, then I'm thinking theoretically that you're developing according to that actual need for that type of housing. And so is it then that you need to know who you are building to?
Yes and no. We'll cover this a little bit further in a bit more detail, Cheryl, but it really depends on the level of risk and the risk profile. You would like to know from as early as you can who is going to move into your house. Ideally who the individuals you or the care provider would have them picked out. However, with the long lead times on SDA, it can be a bit unreasonable to try and lock someone in for, what might be an 18-month or a 24-month project. And the other thing is the NDIS is here to bring choice to participants and the people within the NDIS. So even if I was designing a perfect house for someone that had specific needs, I could be sitting down with them going, right, I've got a fantastic house. How would you like me to design it? I've got this block of land here. What should we do? If I'm still, for example, under construction and someone else finishes a house nearby, the person that I'm working with is under no obligation to move into the property that I may have designed especially for them, because the system's all about giving the people with disabilities, the participants, choice and housing choice. So the government's left it to market drivers to dictate supply and demand. Like, if everyone wants to go out and develop SDA, they can, but the government's not going to fund it. Like, there's not enough people if everyone develops it. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg. Like, I wouldn't blindly go out and develop it. And what we'll find is also that we're getting a first generation of SDA product at the moment. Like, whilst there's not enough dwellings compared to demand, people will move into any dwelling that is specifically built for those with disabilities, because it's better than where the majority are perhaps living now. And many of those may still be in group homes, so larger dwellings with more residents in them. But as the scheme matures, we will find a little bit of people moving between houses. So, they might move in. If I built a house and finished it today, I could most likely get someone moving into it very soon. But, if I build a fairly average house in a fairly average spot with no particular draw cards for that property, and someone else finished a house, in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, but, they were closer to the shops, or, there was good transport amenity nearby, then someone might say, well, actually, Richard, he designed us, the cheap and cheerful option. My bedroom's got more space than I used to have, but, there's a house just down the road and the bedroom's twice as big, and, my lounge room's bigger, and, the cafe's just around the corner. Like, hey, the power's in my hands. I'm going to move. So not only do you need to think about building a good asset for today, you need to build something that's going to have demand in, 10 and 15 years' time as well. Or if you're just building the basics, you're going to risk having an expensive house that's vacant and not having people living in it as you had hoped.
So from what I'm hearing, Richard, is that yes, the numbers, and there's a lot of attraction to NDIS housing. One, because there's a community impact, there's a positive community impact. However, there are risks associated with it as well. One being that it's tied to a government scheme. Two, that it's preferable that you're building to a particular need, but then there's no guarantee that there's going to be someone at the end of it.
Yeah, spot on, Cheryl. And if we could have the next slide, please, Jet. Yeah, so I guess why did I start developing SDA? And you're spot on, Cheryl. The first thing that attracted to me was the higher yields and the better returns. Like, when you look at the numbers, they are very, very attractive, especially when you're just looking at the gross numbers. Like, they can be, too good to be true. And unfortunately for some
people, what are these sort of gross numbers you're talking about? If you can just sort of give us a ballpark.
Sure. If you can build up to a 4-bedroom home, approximately, and that 4-bedroom home would generally have a carer living in it, plus 3 participants under the NDIS. And, each of those people, if you've got a full 3-bedroom house, Southeast Queensland or, most places, the return might be quoted as about $140,000 per annum in income under the NDIS from those 3 people living in the house, sharing together. So $140,000 yield on 3 people living in a house is fantastic. That's not to say it's not achievable. It certainly can be. But yeah, so numbers up to that amount, Cheryl, are achievable, certainly on paper, but not necessarily always in reality. We'll cover a little bit more of that shortly. So, when you look at those numbers, it's quite easy to get, glossy eyes, and starry eyes, and go, wow,
let's do it. Let's just do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in my particular instance, I've done a small development, and everything I'm doing, I incorporate into my developments. I haven't yet done one in a greenfield site. I will in the future now that I've got some good relationships with providers. I like the infill type properties because, you know, I've already got houses next to me. It's guaranteed that the neighbours aren't going to build SDA. So, you know, my house is unique within a small to medium-sized radius. But the particular property I started my journey on was on a very flat block. You know, it was close to two major supermarkets, you know, within 400 metres. The local tavern was 450 metres. There's shops and services, you know, just next to the supermarket, 400 metres away. There's a bus stop outside the house, and not only is it a bus stop with buses, but the buses are accessible. You know, they've got the special entranceway where the side of the bus comes down, and the driver can get the ramp out for those in a wheelchair. And people who are mobile and have a level of independence, or a carer that can travel with them, can actually travel to, you know, to the city or the larger shopping centres on this bus route. Now, one little interesting thing to be aware of, and I didn't think about it because it's never been an issue for me, is that the bus stop's right outside my house or my property. But when you come back, the bus stop's on the opposite side of the road. But if you're in a wheelchair, you can't just come across the road. There's a couple of lanes of traffic each way. There's a traffic island in the middle. So you need to go 300 metres down the road to the traffic lights, cross the road to traffic lights, and then travel another 300 metres back down on the other side of the road to get back home.
Even a curb, like the rest of us will sort of go, oh, well, just step over a curb. Someone on a wheelchair can't do that.
Yeah, you know, so there's so many things that I've never had to consider in my life that, you know, I'm now thinking about. So, you know, I'm in many ways, you know, becoming more educated on the types of things that some people in our community have to live with and deal with, and I consider more of those than I used to. And I'm still learning lots. I by no means know everything, and I learn more every time I talk to the people, in particular that work inside or work at the houses in the specialist disability accommodation, that work with those with disabilities. So, you know, it's great in that I'm always learning more. And, you know, the closer you can work with a provider or a care organisation, the better your houses can be. Admittedly, this first property, the block was only fairly small, like it's only 300 square metres, so it's not a large build footprint. So whilst the design was customisable, you know, there was definitely some constraints on the land, and, you know, I tried to maximise the build footprints within those constraints of the land or the particular block of land, but we were still limited by the dimensions of that block. You know, and as a side effect, you know, I get to do good things for people who really need it within our community. So that's a nice thing to be able to do as well.
Yeah. And the big thing, and we've got a question here, Terry's asked, what are the additional costs to this, which I do know that you do
Jen,
have.
if we can jump to the next slide.
Build costs as well.
Thanks very much, Terry. Great little segue into this particular part of the presentation. But, you know, as you say, they do cost more than a standard house. And some of the reasons why, you know, if you're building high physical support, you need structural steel. So these are large steel beams. You know, you need those in the walls, and they need to be running across the ceiling of the bedrooms to be able to attach the hoists to those structural steel members. And they're not cheap. The price of steel is continuing to go up. So, you know, that's getting more and more expensive. Fire sprinklers, depending on the size of the dwelling, who you're catering towards, you know, fire sprinklers, whilst not necessarily essential, you know, are definitely highly desirable. And if you've got multiple people living in a dwelling, you should be putting them in. Like, talking to the providers, you know, if you've got someone living on their own in a house, the expectation is not necessarily putting fire sprinklers in, but you can. Should you put fire sprinklers in, there's a slightly increased income from the property for having those fire sprinklers installed. But other things you need to do is, you know, thicker walls. For example, your bathrooms need to have a minimum 12mm sheet, a structural sheet, so that you can attach grab rails wherever you need to in the bathrooms. For robust properties in particular, you definitely need thicker walls throughout the house. So you need walls, and you need solid core doors in robust properties. So things where people can't put their fists, a chair or some furniture through the walls or the doors. You potentially need laminated glass or a glass alternative, whether that's Perspex or something else in some of the properties. Your rooms are larger than a regular house, so your build footprint's increased. You've got the same number of bedrooms as a regular house, but your build footprint's increased. Likewise, you've got circulation spaces around front doors, back doors, laundry doors, every door inside the house. You've got circulation spaces within your kitchen, within your dining room. So everything to do with a house is bigger in footprint than a standard house. As I mentioned earlier, the bathrooms are huge. You could almost get away with them being a kid's bedroom in another house. They're about 8 square meters. So they're on the larger side. They're 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters. So they're quite a large size. All your doorways are larger than standard, and some of those doors could be solid core. You're looking to put a drawer style dishwasher in. You're looking to put a side opening oven in, and for a lot of we'll call them packages, if you see an ad on Facebook or somewhere else for NDIS properties, come and buy an NDIS property, fantastic yield, there's going to be a commission in there or a project management fee. Commission can be around $30,000 to $40,000. And the banks and lenders realize that, so they're not going to lend you that amount of money. So, Terry, it's kind of hard to put an exact number on that. It depends on how big the house is, how many bedrooms you've got, who exactly you're catering towards. But, there's definitely additional costs there in the build. And I can't exactly quantify that either at the moment. I've got a number of projects kind of in progress, but, I don't have a huge number for comparison points. And they do vary between states. I mean, Queensland is still cheaper to build in than, for example, New South Wales. Perth is still cheaper than New South Wales and other places. So it does vary a bit depending on your location as well. So thanks, Jet. If we can move to the next slide.
So actually, thanks for that question, Terry, and it was a good segue into that slide. And he did also ask, what's the pathway for approval? So a lot of people do want to find out what that approval process is. I'm not sure if you addressed it in.
Yeah, look, I briefly mentioned that there's a design standard that you need to design to above and beyond the National Construction Code. So that standard exists. I've heard of some people calling themselves, NDIS, I can't remember the word, but, qualified builders. There's no specific qualification necessarily, but, the design must comply, and you then employ an SDA assessor to assess that design for compliance. And then they come in at the end of the project, around the same time as the certifier. They come in with their measuring tape, and they're measuring the angles and the inclines and the steps between one floor level finish and another floor level finish, and they are going through that design standard and checking that off. And if anything in there doesn't comply, I'm sorry, your house does not meet the requirements for NDIS SDA, and therefore you are not signed off as an SDA dwelling on the register, and you are not then able to get the funding associated with that SDA property. So, for example, if your bedroom is, 5 millimeters too small in one of the dimensions, I'm sorry, it doesn't comply. That bedroom is not suitable for the government funding elements of specialist disability accommodation. So it's very tight. You need to get it right, or the penalties of non-compliance is, you've got a really expensive house that is probably very suitable for someone with a disability and very much more suitable than a regular house, but it doesn't meet the requirements to qualify for the additional funding. So that's not a good outcome for the person.
So you've got to make sure you've got a your architect or your design practitioner really understands what those design requirements are.
Yeah, having the architect or the design practitioner understanding the standard will save you time up front, Cheryl. But you still need the assessor to check your design. And this is where you want to make sure you get your assessor to check it nice and early. there's no point submitting your DA to council or getting your design approved and then giving it to your assessor afterwards, and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, this room's too small, that hallway is not right, that doorway is not big enough," and then you need to resubmit to council. So there's a few extra moving parts, and the approvals path is longer because of the disability accommodation, because there's more consultants and experts you need to speak with as part of the journey.
Yeah. Well, we've got Nolan who says, thanks, Cheryl and Richard. Need to drop off now, but great to hear your thoughts and experience. Thanks for joining us, Nolan. Good man. And we've got another question here. Richard, how many rooms do you get or would you typically get on that 300 square meter block?
Look, good question. On that 300 square meter block, I've got 2 rooms. I do have a third room. It's on a first floor. It is not wheelchair accessible. I would not necessarily do it again. I might. It's been lots of good lessons from incorporating that third bedroom into the property. But as a general rule of thumb, on a 300 square meter block, you could fairly safely bet on getting, 2 participants plus a carer, plus the spaces they need to make that house reasonably livable.
And what category of housing have you built that house for?
Sure, that house is high physical support on the ground floor.
Okay. So will anyone live on the top floor? Will that be a carer?
Yeah, the top floor is designed for someone else with a lesser or lower level of disability. So, but having said that, we've learned some good lessons regarding those with improved livability funding. Most people with improved livability funding, for example, need a walker. So, for someone with a walker to navigate stairs is probably an unlikely outcome. So there is some risk around only having stairs. If we could fit a lift in, that would definitely open up the opportunities for who could live upstairs. But there's always options around that room. We've kept it. We could have Section 96 the DA and taken the top floor off, reduced our build costs, and reduced the yield a bit. I've chosen to keep the top floor, but the person up on the top floor will need to navigate some stairs. There's some options there to put like a stair lift in, like the little travelator that sits on the wall. So we've got some options. What the final solution will look like and who's the person that's going to live in there and what their exact requirements are, I'm not yet aware, but we'll come up with a solution that works for someone that needs a nice space to live in. And because the ground floor is a little bit tighter on space than I would like, upstairs is basically designed as a bed sit. So it's got a walk-in robe and an ensuite and quite a large sort of studio-sized room, about 5 by 4 meters, so about 20 square meters. Plus it's got a wet bar, so we've got a kitchenette in the bedroom as well. So it's quite a livable space.
And do these rooms typically, do they have their own kitchenette or everyone uses the main kitchen?
It depends. Some people I've noticed are starting to put kitchenettes or wet bars in all the bedrooms. Certainly it would be a more premium product if every room had a kitchenette. It would take more space. It would cost a little bit more to do. It's definitely not essential, and it would depend on the individual's needs as to what they required. But you would certainly get a more premium product if every room had a kitchenette in addition to the main kitchen.
Okay, right. And so let's come to this. Like we mentioned at the beginning, it all looks very attractive. The numbers look good on paper. But what are the things that you really, before you sort of dip your toes into the space, there we go. What do we need to be aware of?
Sure. Now, as I mentioned before, that the build costs and the costs of the dwelling are going to be higher than a regular house. So, the bank's still going to come in and value your house compared to what another similar house in the area would be like. And for example, if you've built a 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom house in the suburbs, and, your build comes in, more expensive than the others, the bank might just say, if we had to do a fire sale, our target market's still going to be mum and dads. So therefore, we'll just value it as if this was a regular house for mum and dad to live in. Particularly with, SDA is a fairly new space and a new space for lending for banks and lenders. And to be honest, once you understand the risks, you can understand why a bank might say, well, an investor might say, oh, here's my fantastic house. I'm going to make $140,000 a year in rent from this house. So, just lend me all the money. It's great. I'll be able to pay it all back. No problems. But it's not necessarily like that. It can be. But, from a conservative bank's perspective, they're looking at what's the worst case, how bad could it be? And if it doesn't work according to plan, what's the asset we've got and what's that worth? So just be aware that your valuations could well be soft, particularly if you're building a large house with lots of bedrooms and lots of en-suites. It does depend, and it depends on your lender. I don't have any specific recommendations on lenders or finance. I've just got some of my experience, but, this is where a good broker comes in handy and useful. But, from that perspective, some banks won't lend on disability accommodation, or they might lend a reduced LVR. So finance is definitely one of the things you need to work out along the way. And look, this is why I like incorporating disability accommodation into my development projects. I'm manufacturing equity and I'm manufacturing growth. So, I'm turning essentially one property into two, or one property into more than two. So I'm increasing the value and the return on that property and reducing the risk of soft valuations. So that's one of the strategies I use, which is working well for me. But, right from the start, as you mentioned, Cheryl, you've got to think, who's going to live in my house? And people might say, isn't there some detailed map or table? Doesn't the NDIS tell me where everyone is so that I can build where people actually want the houses?
Yep. Are there any supply demand maps?
Of sorts. There are maps which tell you where people currently are. But, it doesn't tell you whether those people are happy in the houses they're in. It doesn't tell you whether they're unhappy. There might be, there's examples where there's like facilities with large group homes, and, it gives an artificial spike, and it says that, for example, there's 50 people living in this particular suburb or area, but, you can't tell whether they're living in outdated accommodation that is not
purpose-built,
as good as what you could provide for them. And if you did provide something better, would they move from that accommodation to where you are? So the way to find people who want to live in your house, like essentially you've got to form a relationship with a third party, with someone that knows that information and data. You could go out and trawl and mine that data yourself and come up with a model there. And, you could potentially add a great deal of value to the system and come up with a new system for working that out yourself. But essentially relationships are the best way to work out that supply and demand. Talk to people that are working with people with disabilities and work out who's around, what they need, and what you should build. Because it comes down to, have you built the right house in the right place, and what have your neighbours built? One example here is, a couple of years ago when there was plenty of land available, for example, lots of people were putting together house and land packages in Southeast Queensland in particular. Southeast Queensland was great because build prices were lower, so you could put together more affordable housing packages, and you could advertise them as fantastic $100,000 plus per year rental yields. But the thing you don't know is who else in that suburb or in the new development has also built disability accommodation. If you purchased a package through company X, is there also companies Y, Z, and ABC in the area too? And even if you're with company X, maybe they've put together multiple house and land packages, and perhaps you thought you were going to get 3 participants living in your house. What if this company has built perhaps 10 houses? Do they get more happy customers if there's 1 person living in each of 10 houses, or do they want to fill the first house up with 3 people, then fill the next house up, and then, the last person's waiting forever or maybe never gets any tenants? So there's a number of dynamics to the whole system, Cheryl, and how companies might work and how they put their overlays over the whole system. And I've got friends that have built properties, 3-bedroom houses, and they've got 1 person living in the house. Maybe 6 months or more later, a second person moved in, and 12 months later, there's still no third person there, and they're quite angry because they were of the belief that there was definitely 3 people going to be moving into their house, and the fact they've only got 2 is very upsetting for them. Despite the fact that if they were told that the rental yields are still very good. For 2 people living in a house, you could be getting $70,000 to $80,000 a year in income, which is still a really good outcome, if that's your expectation.
Yeah. And I guess, well, if your expectation's 120,000 and it's 80 or 90, then there's obviously a misalignment. There's misalignment there. And I hear this quite often. What you're saying, Richard, is there are a lot of people marketing this sort of housing. They've put together the house and land packages, and investors, want to be able to invest in something that's going to give them income, but also something with a purpose. And so it's a very good marketing angle as well to get people in. But there's no guarantee. That's the risk that people are exposed to. That is that no guarantee how long it's going to take to fill a house, and
Exactly.
in fact whether that property is going to be filled.
And if I wanted to grow a business around SDA as quickly and stress-free as I could, I'd get as much land as I could. I'd match it with a project home builder that could build SDA properties for me, and I'd put them together, and I'd get a commission for every build, and I'd do lots of them. And that's a valid business model. But people need to understand the risks associated with that and how that works, and what's the likelihood or the relationship of the people putting those packages together, getting the participants. So there's some people doing it really well, and there are some shonky people out there that are bringing a bad name to everything. So certainly while I'm small and just doing a few projects, it's easy to stay on top of these things. But that takes up more time to run developments and put projects together compared to sourcing land and sourcing a builder and matching the 2 up. That's something that people can scale much quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's look at a few more other things to be aware of. And this is not. I'm conscious that we're not trying to put people off this sort of housing, but it is more a.
Not at all. Like, there are so many good opportunities, Cheryl. It's just go in with your eyes open, because this, as I say down the bottom, this system is about participant choice and giving people with disabilities the choice over where they live. Now, don't get me wrong. If someone's got a 4-bedroom house and it's empty, it's probably going to be fairly easy to get someone to move in, because, like, who wouldn't want to live in a house on their own? And if there's lots of these houses in an area, it's like, that's great. People, if they choose, are more likely to be able to live on their own in a large house. But again, looking at some of these house designs, they may only have 1 living area, and if you've got 3 people with wheelchairs, maybe they've got multiple wheelchairs each, and you look at the size of the houses, then there could be 6 or more wheelchairs in a house. It's like, where do you start to put all this specialist equipment that people need to go about their everyday lives? There's a number of elements to it, and it's definitely a good space to be in. But there's some people definitely avoiding it because the regulatory uncertainty and a number of other elements to do with it. So
Yeah. Another good question here. Are there limits on how many NDIS properties can be offered in a certain area? Is there a possibility that another NDIS home be built close by or even next door to the one that you're going to design or develop?
Yeah, great question. If you've got a new subdivision, every house in that subdivision could be NDIS SDA. Every single house, every house in that new subdivision, plus the stage 2, 3, 4, 5 through to 10 could all be disability accommodation. The only restriction around SDA is the number of dwellings on one title, which typically applies to apartment blocks, and it's limited at, if I remember rightly, 15. I haven't hit the limit, so I don't remember it clearly, but 15 off the top of my head is the limit. But that's 15 on one title. So, you know, if you did smaller apartment blocks or Torrens title properties, you know, there is no limit on how many could be within a particular geographical area. And again, the system is designed by the government to not have those restrictions, to give the choice back to people with disabilities.
Excellent. So again, you know, just be careful if you're looking at these sorts of properties and you're buying it off a project marketer or whoever's selling quite a few of that sort of product. Be aware that just do your due diligence. Really, a lot of this is, and what you're bringing up is to be able to highlight the things that we need to consider. Be aware of, not be afraid of. It's just knowing that there is a level of risk management that needs to occur.
Yeah, and if you're building a 4-bedroom house for 3 people to live in, like, you know, the 3-bedroom house I'm building, the moment one person moves into the house, you know, my costs are covered and I'm getting market rent essentially for the property. The moment the second person moves in, you know, I'm in front. The moment the third person moves in, you know, I'm having a party every day of the week. You know, it's good times. But, like, you know, part of my risk mitigation is, what do I expect? What am I happy with? And, you know, when the first person moves in, it's like, that's fine. You know, and if I build, you know, a nice house that's suitable for 3 people and only get one person in, you know, there's going to be someone that wants to live in a house on their own or with one other person. Like, it's, you know, these are part of my risk mitigators that I'm quite comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned these government guaranteed returns, and, you know, we see the marketing.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And are they guaranteed? What does that mean?
No. The NDIS SDA payments are guaranteed to be a certain amount for a certain, actually, there's a good point. In the price guide, so there's a thing called the SDA price guide. It tells you how much the payments are going to be based on the area you're in, the type of property you build, how many participants the house is designed for, whether you've got fire sprinklers or not, and a few other criteria. Now, just be aware that payment price guide is assuming that the participant is 100% funded. So not everyone is funded to 100% of the level within the SDA price guide. So again, like, if you're told that the rents or the income will be a certain amount, you know, the true amount might be 80 or 90% of that, for example. And then you've still got the management fees of the provider that is actually finding you the participants. That there's also likely to be a fee for finding the participants as a one-off fee up front. You'd need to check if there's a fee should someone move out. Is there another fee to find someone to move in and fill that room again? You would need to check. But there will always be a management fee on the providers. And, you know, that can be, you know, I've heard numbers sort of 18, 20 plus % per annum on management fees. So, you know, all of a sudden you've got that, and then who wears the vacancy risk? But, you know, SDA is tied to the person, not to the property. Again, the system is about participant choice. So if the person moves out of your house, they take their funding with them and they move to another house, and the funding goes to them and the owner of the new house. Please don't get too glossy-eyed over the figures that says, hey, this house will give you a return of, you know, it'll say something like returns of up to, you know, and that's assuming that you get the maximum number of people with the maximum subsidies that are no doubt high physical support, which is,
and on
possible.
average, Richard, sorry to interrupt, my question, longevity of, you know, because you've mentioned here the SDA is tied to a person, not a house. And assuming that there is someone who has specific sort of disability that which that house is designed for, like what's the longevity of these leases?
It varies, Cheryl. Like some of the providers will provide more of a commercial lease. So it could be a 5+5+5 or a 10+5.
Okay, yeah.
Like I've seen at least one where the lease stipulated that to get out of the lease, the property needed to be vacant for at least 6 months with no one living in the property and unable to find anyone to live in it. So you would have to fund 6 months of a vacant property before you're able to break your lease with your provider.
Yeah, wow.
So, imagine if you had someone in the property, you were kind of just breaking even, and then that person moved out. But for 6 months, you've got a vacant property that you can't do anything with, or you're in breach of your contract. So it varies. Like I've also seen them down to as little as 60 days notice, and it kind of depends a little bit. Like broadly speaking, most of the leases will be a head lease with a provider, and you as the owner of the property will likely never know anything about the people that are living in the house due to the privacy. You don't need to. You sign a lease with the provider, a head lease, and then there's two types of leases. Some providers will offer a fixed return income or fixed income return, whether that's 7 or 8%, and they'll pay that return regardless of how many people are living in your house. Or you might get a pass-through lease where, the provider takes a set management fee and any residual marketing or any residual income after that management fee is taken out goes to the owner of the property. But again, then the risk of vacancy goes on the owner. So there's two different models, and it varies a little between providers and depending on who's willing to take what risk.
Yeah, yeah. And let's have a look. The other thing we talked about very briefly was, whether in that planning process and development process that we can be very clever to do all the planning and get someone locked in, which is, from what I understand, not as easy as it may seem.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, like I had a conversation last week with two people who've got SDA in their plans. They're on the Central Coast, and they'd love a property that they could move into. If anyone's got any land on the Central Coast, happy to help organise building a property for them. But they would like to live in the northern parts of the Central Coast.
Yeah.
They've got funding, and they're after a house for them. They've got a couple of things that they'd like in their ideal house. But they come with funding, and someone like that is prepared to wait for their ideal house. They want to be a little bit more involved in the design of it and how it would look and work. And if you've got some relationships with some people in the disability space and providers, then you can do a little bit more of that. Alternatively, there is still strong demand in parts of the NDIS at the moment. Very much around, Sydney, where prices are high to start with. There's not much disability accommodation being built because dads are busy building their own houses. So, there's definitely areas of the market where there's strong demand, and, you could build it and not know specifically who was going to move in, but, you know that you've built the right product in the right area or a reasonable area such that it's going to have demands to people and providers. And that someone will move into it. And, this is part of the risk mitigation. It's like, I may not have the exact person that's going to move into it, but, what's my level of confidence and comfort that someone would like to move into this house and, potentially have a forever home that works for them. And, I'm talking to some providers, they're like, we don't want to lock in people too early in the process because build times are blowing out. Things are supposed to be finished in, certain amount of time, and they're not. So they're waiting longer than they were previously to lock in specific people.
Yeah. I know we've got probably about another 5 minutes, Richard, and
Okay.
I know we've got a bit of a draft plan to give people an idea of what SDA housing might look like. So we might
Yeah,
do
if
a
we can skip
quick
through, Cheryl, I think there might be.
skip through to the pictures. There we are.
Yeah, yeah,
So
sure.
talk us through
That's
this.
the
Is
one
this
that.
one of your projects, the 3-bedroom and the one on the top?
This is the 3-bedroom with the one upstairs. So this is three. Well, if we just took the downstairs, there's 2 rooms which are suitable for up to high physical support, plus 2 bathrooms. One of them's drawn as an ensuite, and one of them's drawn as a bathroom. It's not the largest kitchen, dining, and living space, and I would like to make it bigger, but unfortunately, the block constraints here limit our build footprint, and this is the maximum build footprint we can get on that block. So I've designed, or the designer has done the biggest footprint we can, incorporating as much of the standard in there as we can. So this is an example of what something might look like. Of course, you need the garage or the carport in addition to this, and then you've got all the regular council planning requirements as well. So this one was done as a group home, so the council planning requirements were above and beyond what you need for a standard residential dwelling. So this was a good lesson along the way. And I've got the steps. You could take that step space out and have some extra space downstairs, some additional flexibility, but only have 2 participants. What's marked as the study is the carer's office.
Okay. I was going to ask about the study. I'm like, how do you work out who uses the study or not?
Yeah, but there's not as much storage in this house as I would like. I mean, you could always do things better, but like I said, for a location perspective, for people that want to be close to services and infrastructure, there's shops nearby. If someone's got a level of independence, they can go to the cafe and the shops every day. They can chill out and have like a lifestyle where they don't need a vehicle, or they can catch the bus. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Like, I recognise that this is not a perfect house in the burbs, but I hope I'm looking for the right people for this house that appreciate the location of it, as much as they do the house, and they go, there's enough space for what I need. And then, as I mentioned before, upstairs is basically a self-contained studio that's accessed through the house. So, someone could live independently upstairs, and, there's not as much living space downstairs, but, with an extra large bedroom upstairs, the person that lives up there doesn't need to spend as much time downstairs should they choose not to. This is an example of the type of property you could do.
Excellent. And the question is, was this one on a corner block? And if so, are corner blocks favourable for NDIS design?
This is a corner block. Is it favourable? It depends on the design you get. Depends, how deep is it? How wide? Where's your parking going to be? How do you incorporate parking? Like, if this was a front-loaded block where you had a garage at the front, and then you had to have a hallway down beside it, and all you could fit was a hallway and a small living space, then, it comes down to a question of, is that dead space or is it a useful second living area? If your block's extra wide, could you have a hallway plus a bedroom? So it depends. Corner blocks are not necessarily better or worse. It comes down to your design.
Yeah. And this one's a single bedroom with a carer's room.
Yeah, and this is not the design we ended up going for on this block, but a good little takeaway from this particular design is the red dotted lines. These are all circulation spaces. So where you think things are nice and simple, like look at the bedroom door in particular down the bottom of the screen, and the bathroom size. You think, well, why don't I just make my robe a bit bigger? Why don't I put a robe in somewhere else? Why don't I put it on another wall? It's like, you can't.
You can't. Okay. Yeah.
You are restricted by the amount of space and circulation spaces required at times, and this is where your designer needs to be smart. Otherwise, you've got so much backwards and forwards on designs. You get a new revision. Oh, look, it doesn't comply here. You get another revision. Oh, look, it doesn't comply in this new little element you didn't even think of before.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't look like this design. It was a complex build. Like, the number of hips and valleys you've got on the roof is not ideal. But it was a good little design and illustrates the type of things you might consider. And smaller dwellings, we didn't really touch on participant matching, but if you've got 3 people in a house, they've got to be compatible. They've got to live in harmony together. The less people you've got living together, the less personality conflicts you're liable to have, and the happier the life in your house is likely to be.
I mean, it's hard enough when you got three adults living in one room with different personalities, let alone when there's different personalities and disabilities as well.
Yep, definitely. And yeah, if you can avoid or reduce personality matching and give people more space, more living areas, these are desirable features and functions in homes and properties. When I was designing this one, the provider said to me, like, why aren't you putting a second bedroom in? Like, that the income will be so much better for you. Like, we didn't think anyone would want to put a 1-bedroom house there. And I'm like, I don't mind, I'm thinking that, the return on this, a property, similar to this should be about $60,000 a year. Should I get someone on high physical support with maximum funding, that return on this dwelling size could be up to $70,000 a year. I'm like, why would I push a bit harder for $90,000? I'm like, I'm happy with 60 or 70. That's fine by me. I keep it nice and simple. I'm happy.
And then you're not having to manage the the challenges that come with that matching requirement as well.
Yeah, you avoid a number of those complexities that would have to be dealt with otherwise. Who'd say no to a few properties in their portfolio that were returning, $60,000, $70,000 a year, Cheryl?
Not that many. That's a pretty decent return. We've got enough time for one more question here. Does the team of consultants, in particular engineers and architects, need to be specialist NDIS professionals?
No, they do not. There's only one that does. Your design needs to comply, but you need the SDA assessor. They do need to be qualified to assess your design against the standard, and they're the ones that check that your design does comply, and they're the ones that come back at the end of the project and check that your builders built it in accordance with the plans and that it still complies, because if it doesn't, you're in trouble. For example, if this bedroom was 10 millimeters too short in a particular dimension, this house would not comply with the SDA requirements. And, I could rent it out to someone on the rental market, but I don't get any additional SDA payments, nothing. So, all that work is in vain. So,
and
it's...
I mean, that's the bit, sort of the point that you brought up previously as well, was get the assessor on board or on side from an early state to be able to look at how you're progressing with your design.
Yep. Yeah, engage them early and keep them involved. Like, there's little things, like things you don't even consider, that they'll pick up for you and help you with, and everything they say you need to incorporate or you're in trouble. And you don't want to get in trouble, because it can really hurt the bottom line. So it's simple, but it's not easy. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and there is no SDA how-to guide. It doesn't exist.
Might need to create one, Richard.
There's a market opportunity there, Cheryl. There definitely is.
There you go. Well, I think we've covered quite a bit today, Richard. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for those of you that have commented and asked questions and engaged. And obviously, there's a lot more to this. There's a lot more information as well on the NDIS site. And again, because I mean, I haven't had much experience in this space myself. I do know a few people that are doing a lot of NDIS and have done it for quite a few years. And again, the thing that I'm constantly reminded is understand and be aware that it's not all the big numbers. The big numbers can be achieved. However, there's a lot of that risk mitigation and really understanding what you're getting into. Don't go into this with go into this with your eyes wide open and be absolutely aware of what the potential risks are. So thank you, Richard, for answering our questions so openly and sharing some of your NDS learnings thus far. Love your work. You've got a bit of a fan base there. Okay, anyone that's keen to speak to Richard, understand a little bit more, he's doing some project management as well. So feel free to reach out to him. The best email would be info@brickport.com.au. You're obviously on Facebook as well, so reach out to him in the DMs. And it's great, Richard. What we'd love to do is to touch base, say, in about a year or so, see how things have gone, well, the learnings that have come out with actually getting tenants in as well. And yeah, be great to see you, produce a few more of these as well.
There'll be a few more coming out shortly, Cheryl. So looking forward to sharing the journey as I go.
Fantastic. Appreciate it very much. And everyone else, like I mentioned, I know this is an area with a lot of interest. Reach out to Richard. Look and see if you guys can connect. If there's stuff that he can help you with your projects, fantastic. Otherwise, that is it for this episode of The Business of Property. I appreciate you all joining us. If you enjoyed this session and would like to be informed of when we've got new episodes, please like the Business of Property YouTube channel. You found value in today's show, hit the like button and you'll get notified when the bing goes up. So till next time, keep warm, stay well, and we'll see you next time. Cheers. Bye.